I'm Jeff Ransell. I work for the Nature Conservancy here in Texas, and the focus of this session is in the Endangered Species Act and land conservation. So I guess because of the land conservation part of that, I'm qualified to be up here talking to folks since I'm not a biologist. But I think this is a really great session. I think the Land Trust Council should be commended for putting this topic on the session this year, and I think we'll have some pretty lively and interesting discussions. We've got some great panelists, all of whom have different roles and are involved in different aspects of endangered species conservation regulation in Texas. So we're not going to do any PowerPoint presentations or anything droll or nappy like that right after lunch. So each of the I've seen yours, David, plenty of times. So each of the panelists is going to talk for a little bit of time about what they do, how they're involved with the Endangered Species Act, and then I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions of the panelists. So, David, do you want to start?
Yes, happy to. My name is David Wolf. I'm Director of Conservation Strategies with Environmental Defense Fund here in Austin. And I have spent the past about 22 years of my career working with endangered species conservation, primarily on private lands. So working with private landowners to encourage them in various ways to participate in endangered species conservation through a variety of incentives. So it's regulatory incentives to get them over the concern of the Endangered Species Act and the restrictions that either real or perceived that they feel might encumber their land. So tools like Safe Harbor, which is a regulatory assurance type tool, which allows a landowner to do something beneficial for an endangered species without encumbering long-term multi-generational restrictions. And I'm not going to get into any detail on that today. I wanted to talk about some other more exciting new tools that we've been involved with. My experience in Texas working with private landowners is that they respond very positively to a lot of different types of conservation incentives. Certainly financial incentives can have a positive impact. Over the last 18 months, I have spent pretty much all of my time working on the lesser prairie chicken, which is not actually on the endangered species list yet, but was proposed as threatened at the end of 2012. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to make a decision next month as to whether it's not going on the list, or it's going on the list as threatened, or it's going on the list as endangered. So a final determination is going to be made next month. The lesser prairie chicken is just one of over a couple of hundred candidate species that have been in kind of this limbo situation for many years, but now the Fish and Wildlife Service is under court order to make a decision literally on more than 200 species within about the next 2 years. So it's a huge crush for them. It's a major concern for some of the economic activities going on in the West, energy development especially, because of what a listing for a species like the lesser prairie chicken, which covers 5 states, greater sage grouse, which covers 11 states. So the potential economic impact there is huge. So, we've got a variety of tools in the toolbox for conserving species. Farm Bill conservation programs, conservation easements, which we're spending a lot of time talking about at this conference, conservation banks, in lieu fee programs, etc. And they all have their place, they all have strengths, but they all have weaknesses. One of the weaknesses that I perceive, don't worry, Jeff, I'm going to wrap this up in a couple minutes, is the inability of some of these tools to engage large numbers of working landowners. And by working landowners, I mean farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, depending on where you are in the country, to engage them relatively quickly and in a streamlined fashion in conservation. And for a species like the lesser prairie chicken, where the experts tell me we're going to need something like 7 to 9 million acres of habitat being actively managed for that species. We need some new tools to deal with that kind of habitat need. So what EDF has been working on with partners in the energy industry, agricultural industry, and other conservation interests is something called a habitat exchange approach. And that basically, it's a structure set up where landowners are empowered to implement conservation actions, benefiting, in this case, the lesser prairie chicken, and they'll generate credits for that activity. So it could be putting a permanent easement on the land and managing for the chicken. It'll also include term agreements. Anyone who's worked with private landowners in the West knows that, you know, you'll have some landowners who'll be willing to do permanent from the outset, but the larger percentage are going to want to dip their toe in the water first with something of 10 or 20 or maybe even 30 years. And my experience has been, once you get some of those landowners participating in those term agreements, it can often lead to longer term agreements down the road. So that's a positive thing. So anyway, we've been working with energy and agricultural partners to set up this exchange. It puts the regulatory tools in place with the Fish and Wildlife Service to make it relatively easy for private landowners to engage in conservation, generate mitigation quality credits that energy companies can then purchase to offset the impacts that they're having on habitat. So a key goal of this is to engage large numbers of landowners. Every transaction has to create a net benefit for the chicken. This is only doing us good if we put that chicken on a positive trajectory. And if you've looked at the trend numbers for the chicken, it's in deep trouble. There was something like 2 million prairie chickens estimated just in Texas in the 1800s. The 2013 survey showed a little over 17,000. So we need some new tools and new answers. Anyway, I think I'll stop there, Jeff, and give the other folks some time to introduce themselves.
Thanks, David. John?
Can everyone hear me? We're getting a little feedback up here. Everybody in the back of the room hear me? Yes? Okay. My name is John Davis. I'm the Wildlife Diversity Program Director for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. For those of you that may not know much about Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, I presume most of you do. We're the state agency that's mandated to manage and conserve wildlife resources of the state. Rare species in the Wildlife Division, I don't want to get into the structure of our agency, but we have Wildlife Division, Inland Fisheries Division, and Coastal Fisheries Divisions. They're all natural resource divisions. And we all deal with rare species, but when it comes to wildlife, the Wildlife Diversity Program is the program kind of in charge of dealing with rare species. And the Wildlife Diversity Program is kind of divided into 3 sub-programs, and 2 of those 3 programs is dealing with rare species in some form or fashion. Perhaps most notably, we have the Texas Natural Diversity Database. I don't know if you've seen the booth out front with NatureServe and the TX NDD, but they've been here for the duration of the event, kind of talking a little bit about what we do there. But that database is the state's official repository for all of the observations and element occurrences for rare species and rare resources in the state. We also have the state ologists, we like to affectionately call them, the ornithologist, herpetologist, et cetera. They all work in our programs, and so they're frequently the ones that are on the front lines of dealing with rare species issues. And we also work with private landowners as well. But also in the Wildlife Division, not necessarily directly related to the Wildlife Diversity Program, our department has biologists on the ground that work with landowners to help manage wildlife resources across the state. And I would say with that, I'll stop.
Great, thanks. Alan?
You bet, Jeff. Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Great.
Exactly.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name's Alan Glenn. I'm a partner in the Sedgwick Law Firm, and I practice endangered species law and essentially have been involved in all aspects of endangered species regulation over the past 25 years. What I'll focus on just briefly are the things that I do that are more conservation oriented, and that's principally 3 areas. One is habitat conservation plans. under the Endangered Species Act. Another is using federal grant funds of various sorts to conserve lands that contain endangered species. And then lastly, working on banks and the more sort of innovative cutting edge things like habitat exchanges. With respect to habitat conservation plans, I've probably worked on as many as any attorney in the country. I was the vice chair of the steering committee for the Balcones Plan here in Austin, Travis County. And then I was counsel for the development of the Williamson County Plan, the Hayes County Plan, and the Comal County Plan. And I'm pleased to say those last two are finally approved, something we'll discuss in a minute. I'm currently lead counsel for two multi-state habitat conservation planning efforts for the wind industry. One, the Great Plains Habitat Conservation Plan, which the lead species is the whooping crane, but it will also cover the lesser prairie chicken that David mentioned. And the other is the Midwest Wind Habitat Conservation Plan, which is mainly about 5 species of bats, including the listed Indiana bat. And continue, in addition to these regional scale habitat conservation plans, to work on a number of individual project habitat conservation plans in a lot of different locations. So that's habitat conservation plans. In terms of using grant funds, and Jeff and I have worked together on a lot of this, we have been successful in obtaining the conservation of lands in Texas and in other locations through some of the limited funding that's available under the Endangered Species Act called the non-traditional Section 6 grant funds. 3 categories: habitat conservation plan development, which is soft money for actually developing habitat conservation plans, habitat conservation plan enhancement, and recovery, what's it called? Recovery implementation. Thank you, Todd. And so we've acquired properties on the Texas coast, in Texas Hill Country, all over. Most recently, and Jeff was heavily involved in this one, we were able to add 400 plus more acres to the Government Canyon State Natural Area. There are people in the room from Texas Parks and Wildlife who had a huge role in getting that done and deserve a lot of credit. Lastly, I've been involved in conservation banking and beginning to be involved in some of the more innovative things like David talked about with the Habitat Exchange. My client David Johnston is sitting here in the front row. He had the first conservation bank in this region of the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's the Hickory Pass Ranch Conservation Bank, and it received the top award at the Austin Business Journal Commercial Real Estate Awards as an innovative real estate transaction. It's probably one of the most economically successful conservation banks around so far. We've done other banks for the golden cheek warbler, including the Clearwater Conservation Bank in Burnett County, which is so far the largest conservation bank in the country at 21,000 acres. Another client of mine sitting in the front row there, Wayne Walker, is developing a 5-state conservation bank for the lesser prairie chicken. And, you know, I'm really a fan of conservation banks. We've had some difficulties I hope I get to talk about getting them approved of late. But they really offer, I think, a solid base of assurances for both the resource, the banker, and the mitigation buyer. So happy about that. Also working on a giant conservation bank, proposed conservation bank in Wyoming at 300,000 acres. And then along with David, I'm on a team of folks working for the state of Nevada on trying to do a habitat exchange for the greater sage grouse. Now I'll shut up.
Thank you. Pleased to have Deborah Bills here. Deborah's relatively new to Texas. She's with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I thought you might tell us a little bit about where you've come from and how the Fish and Wildlife Service offices that are organized and where you fit in.
Sure. Again, my name is Deborah Bills. I'm in the Arlington Ecological Services office. I just got there in October. This was my very first drive to Austin and learned about one lane on I-35 South. prior to coming here, I was in the Arizona Ecological Services Office where I was the assistant field supervisor. This was a promotion for me. I became the field supervisor. So the way the Fish and Wildlife Service, Ecological Services is sort of organized, we have 3 offices, one in Arlington, where I am the project leader, one in Austin, where Adam Zarender is the project leader, and then the coastal southern one is Edith Erfling, who you probably know. We also have different divisions that handle other things that are not related to ecological services that you are all familiar with: refuges, fisheries, law enforcement, all those programs. So that's how we're structured. Let's see. What about the office? What can I tell you about the office? It's a great office. I feel really fortunate to have this job. I have a lot of experience working with ecological services, but it was very competitive, and I just feel really privileged to have it. It's a great staff. They work really hard. The Partners for Fish and Wildlife programs, some of you probably know, they're out there pounding the pavement to work with landowners to secure conservation on the ground and providing flexibility for ongoing management. It's really a good group of people. We also have the endangered species folks, who you probably know, who are working on things like the black-cap vireo and the candidate species like the lesser prairie chicken. Our office also has folks working on environmental contaminant types of programs, including some ongoing stuff left over from BP, but just some ongoing issues to evaluate water quality, information that can be useful for any number of programs, listing, ongoing mitigation, that sort of a thing. We also have a group working on federal projects, and those are the traditional Fish and Wildlife Service programs to evaluate 404 project, floodways, that sort of a thing. So I think that's enough, unless you don't want me to say something else.
No, I think that's good, and some of the topics that you had in your PowerPoint, I'm going to ask in questions. Deborah, I think I'll start with you. Describe the expected outcome and current results of the recent federal lawsuit with the Center of Biological Diversity, and specifically on listing species decisions as it relates to Texas. How is that affecting us, in your opinion, and what's going to result from that?
So you're referring to the ongoing, what we call the multi-district litigation. That was a sort of a settled case between Center, Wild Earth Guardians, and some other folks. I think David mentioned earlier, it was a very robust case against the Fish and Wildlife Service for failing to make decisions on species that had been candidates for a very long time, some decades, And so we entered into an agreement to come up with a schedule, a 5-year schedule, and you have seen the results of that probably and I think you're going to get my PowerPoint later. I think it's going to be on the website or something, and I have a list of things that we've acted on for 13 and that we intend to work on for 14 and 15. But to answer your specific question, how has it impacted Texans, or how has it impacted landowners? I would say the biggest impact is that it has forced us to move very fast. It has forced us to move very fast and to work on a lot of species. The good news is we have some really good folks working on stuff here in Texas, in all those offices, in Corpus Christi and Austin and up in Arlington. And so I think that having those folks take the lead with our folks in the regional office, working with the state, working with our partners, working with Washington, we've been able to come up with a pretty good strategy. But it's a lot of change in a relatively small amount of time. I think that's probably the biggest change.
It seems that locally, the leaning of the service in terms of listing decisions has been more towards threatened than endangered. And there's a regulatory difference between that you might be able to talk about and describe a little better.
Sure. So an endangered species means that the species range-wide is in danger of extinction. And a threatened species means that the species range-wide is in danger of becoming endangered. So it's a little bit of a hierarchy there. I don't know whether or not everyone believes that we're leaning toward threatened species. I think some folks might say it seems like everything is endangered, but that's good to know that some people think that we're not always going for the endangered determination. One of the advantages of listing species as threatened is that it allows us to have what we call the 4D rule that provides flexibility for landowners. I think that in general, most of the species that we have listed as threatened have that provision attached to them. Not all of them, but most of them. And when we are working on those packages, we in the Fish and Wildlife Service, we are working with our state partners and working with our collaborators to come up with strategies to determine whether or not that listing can support a 4D rule. And if it can, we are tending to go that way. If it can't support a 4D rule, then we simply won't have it attached to it. But that is the provision that provides more flexibility for on the ground management without having to go through the provision of take or incidental take or a Section 10 permit.
So talk a little bit about the 4D rule and how that actually impacts your regulatory role in the private landowner and land trusts' role in conservation.
Okay, so let's say that we had a species that we were going to list as threatened, and we had a 4D rule, and that 4D rule was going to provide for example, ongoing range practices on the ground if they were in compliance with perhaps an NRCS guidance document. That would mean that anyone who was in compliance with the NRCS guidance, just for example, then there would be no incidental take associated with the ongoing management practices on the ground for that case. So you simply wouldn't have the provision of take or incidental take. It would just be removed from the equation altogether. If you weren't in compliance, then you would be subject to incidental take and all the things associated with a Section 9 takings violation.
I'm sure we'll let you talk about that a little bit more when we have questions from the audience. John, you mentioned in your talk about the Heritage Program. And when I started working professionally in conservation in Texas, it was the mid 1990s with Julie Shackelford there in the audience. And it was an interesting time. Parks and Wildlife couldn't get away fast enough from the Heritage database. And the Nature Conservancy took that over and ran that program for a number of years, and I think one of the more interesting developments recently is that Parks and Wildlife's kind of taken that back on again. Describe the department's thinking about that and sort of the evolution of retaking that program and the thinking behind it.
Wow, that predates me in my role, and so I won't be able to speak intelligently about the whole evolution of why we began to take that back. I can tell you that Natural Heritage Program that we officially call Texas Natural Diversity Database forms kind of the basis or the foundation for all of our knowledge for a particular species, where those species are found, our observations, actually populations, et cetera. And so since I have come on board, my perspective of that Natural Heritage Database is one of kind of the central hub for the wheel. Everything else that we're doing is either contributing to that or pulling from that as we begin to try to understand these larger issues of our species actually declining, or have they always been rare? As we try to answer those questions, that Texas Natural Diversity Database is pivotal to all of that. And so to me, it makes perfect sense that it's housed where it is now. I can't speak to the history, so I'll have to leave it at that.
Okay. I think I might point at David because he's been around long enough. What do you think is the sort of what's behind the department taking that over? Was there a kind of a fundamental change in landowner attitudes and attitudes in Texas that you think is kind of going on?
So John wouldn't speculate, but you want me to? Is that what you're saying, John?
Well, he dodged.
Well, I was around in the mid-'90s and worked with many of the biologists who were in the heritage program at that time. And as you know, in the mid-'90s, the whole issue of the golden cheek warbler listing and the uproar it created amongst private property right groups and kind of the perceived or real potential impacts of a listing of the warbler on private property rights was a very hot topic. It created a lot of ill will, unfortunately. I think it set us back in conservation, at least for a period of time. It was a learning experience for a lot of us in terms of the fact that we do have to engage private landowners really in all the discussion about conservation in order to be effective with them. We can't dictate to them how it's going to be because it won't work. So I think that had a lot to do with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department being very sensitive about collecting information, what information would be available. So that's my take on why they kind of stepped back from the role of aggressively collecting that kind of information, and issues about confidentiality of that kind of information were very hot at the time. So, and clearly since that time, 2 decades, I've seen, I know you've seen, Jeff, and many of the folks on this panel have seen, really a sea change in landowner attitudes about willingness to work with the state agencies, nonprofits, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have all learned a lot of lessons about how to work more effectively and positively with private landowners, and that's a good thing. So I would suggest that, and there's still work to do there, for sure. I mean, it's a private land state. If you're going to conserve any at-risk species in this state, you've got to work with large numbers of private landowners. So you've got to have tools that work. You've got to have confidentiality provisions that work. Landowners, a significant segment, especially the working landowners, the farmers and ranchers, are still very concerned about whether information collected from their place is going to be available to the public or not. So that's still a very valid concern. But I think in terms of relationships and willingness to listen to a message from state agency or conservation organization, there's much more openness there. And so I would suggest that we're in a better place now to take on a natural heritage type role, because we need that kind of information to be effective in conservation planning and conservation action.
Do you, David, do you think, or maybe anybody else on the panel, think that the financial incentives associated with endangered species conservation have had anything to do with changing that attitude? That might be a leading question.
Well, I'll just say a couple of words, and then some of the other folks might like to respond to that. No doubt it has. Farm Bill conservation funds have been available. The lesser prairie chicken would be in much more trouble if it weren't for CRP, in Kansas specifically. So,
David, you might elaborate on that. Not everybody in the audience would know why.
The CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program, part of the Farm Bill, and so it basically gives landowners a cost share as well as a yearly payment, a rental payment they call it, to take a fallow field and plant it into grasses, so kind of restore it to the native condition. In Kansas, they used a native mix for their prairie mix to restore the grasses there. Some of the other states did not. And there are challenges there in actually getting native mixes, so it's not necessarily the fault of anyone that non-native species were used. Those are typically, they're cheaper, they're easier to get. Sometimes they're the only thing you can get. But in Kansas, they did have availability of native seed, and because of that, the lesser prairie chicken has done reasonably well in Kansas as compared to some of the other states. But the other conservation funds that are available, private funds that come to nonprofits for conservation action, absolutely yes. Landowners are interested in those kinds of incentives. We would like to see more sustainability built into those kinds of funds, so that it's something that landowners can actually take into their business planning. That's what we would like to see in the future.
Thanks. Alan, I've got a 2-part question for you. and I know you've been involved in a great number of habitat conservation planning efforts in Texas. The two-part question is really, what are the benefits of working under a habitat conservation plan for a local community? And then the second question is that recently the approval process for the habitat conservation plans it's taken a long time, I think a lot longer than anybody anticipated. And this audience might be interested to know in some of the sticking points, some of the things that local governments or the Fish and Wildlife Service have resisted and that have taken so long to get those plans approved.
Okay. Well, as to the first part, I'm a big believer in habitat conservation plans as a very effective tool under the Endangered Species Act. They only came to the act in 1983 as an escape valve for people who might otherwise take endangered species. So the benefits, I think, are numerous. One, at a regional scale, a habitat conservation plan is often far more time and cost efficient from the applicant's point of view. So you take, for example, the Balcones plan, a project that might take 2 years and $100,000 or more to permit under an individual permit through the Fish and Wildlife Service now is a matter of weeks at most. So it's a huge efficiency to the landowner developer side, and that's not just for private speculative developers. That includes county roads and schools and a lot of important public infrastructure as well. By the same token, by doing something on a larger scale, you're able to make more effective decisions about the conservation of the species covered by the plan. You're able to aggregate mitigation into larger, better formed preserves, which have a higher likelihood of sustaining the conservation of that species into the future. Hopefully, and I think this is often the case, you also ultimately, it's very difficult to develop these, but once it's developed, you significantly reduce the workload of the Fish and Wildlife Service, because typically it's a unit of state or local government steps in and takes over most of the administrative burden of processing these permit applications. And then lastly, the stakeholder processes that go along with developing regional scale habitat conservation plans are great ways to get community consensus around these issues that were so controversial in the mid-90s, and that I think these habitat conservation plans have been part, certainly not all, but part of the equation of diffusing the fear and animosity that overran endangered species discussions in that time frame. In terms of what's been going wrong with the time frame for approval of these plans, a couple of specific examples that I mentioned earlier. Both the Hays County Regional Plan and the Comal County Regional Plan were funded about 70% by federal grant funds, so they were supported by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had a person assigned to each of those plans who attended all of the stakeholder meetings, all of the plan development meetings, and those plans were completed, and generally quite quickly, for given the level of effort that it takes. They were then approved by the Austin Ecological Services field office, and then went up to the regional office. And there they sat, and I mean sat, for 3 years. It's difficult to say exactly why that's so, but I think part of it is change in personnel. One of the people who had managed one of these plans retired. The other got pulled off onto special assignments, the lesser prairie chicken. And so you no longer had in the hierarchy the person who actually handled the development of the plan. So the people who were reviewing at the regional office were sort of left out of context. The other thing with the two big species in these plans, the golden cheek warbler and the black-capped vireo, thoughts about conservation of these species were moving within the conservation community and within the Fish and Wildlife Service while these plans were under review. And so the service had a hard time thinking, well, we're about to adopt pretty new standards for conservation of the golden cheek warbler and the black-capped vireo, and do these plans really meet those standards? And so we ended up, particularly in the case of Comal, with some last-minute tweaks to the plans. I don't think they were particularly onerous or bad, but took a lot of time to get done. And I think, I'm a big believer in habitat conservation plans. I wish we could do more of them, and I wish that the service could get back to processing them more promptly.
Great, thanks. So Deborah, the establishment of conservation banks in Texas has been a little bit of a mixed bag. It's a fantastic tool and has been really created quite a bit of good conservation where that might not have happened before. But it's also been a difficult process in terms of getting banks established and setting criteria and those kinds of things. Did you have much experience that you bring to Texas with conservation banking?
I don't, but I will say that it's the same situation as Alan described with the habitat conservation plans. It's the same group of people doing one more thing, and you know, when we can process them, we can. But most of the time frame is really unsatisfactory.
Is it? I guess there's kind of a tension on, or I should say not tension, but a tension on that issue. Do you think that the new criteria that have been established is going to have especially for the golden cheek warbler and black-cap vireo banks, will have any sort of result in terms of speeding up that process or making that a little bit smoother and more consistent?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if anything will speed up the process. I can tell you, though, that I'm just going to talk about the improving ESA implementation effort that we started a few years ago. And one of the things that is not on the list right now, but is this effort to improve our mitigation policy. And so there's hopes that the conservation banking mitigation policy we might see some improvements there, but I am not certain that we will see anything happen in the next year.
With the conservation bank, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in case the audience is not aware of this, always requires a conservation easement to protect the land, whether the land is owned by a conservation entity or not. The service recently in their criteria moved to work with landowners that have been accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. Have you been involved with that or familiar with those?
Yeah.
Okay. Alan, is that something that
yeah, I mean, and one of the things that's interesting, particularly for those of you who are more in sort of the traditional land trust role, is when a land trust steps into the role of the easement holder in a conservation bank, it's really a fairly significantly different animal than, say, a tax-driven conservation transaction. Just one example is tax-driven conservation transaction is going to have a very long, detailed list of conservation values that are sought to be preserved because that's something the IRS looks for. In a conservation bank, you're really focused just on the covered species of the conservation bank and the values that help to conserve it. So you get a little bit of a disconnect in the negotiation with a land trust who hasn't yet gotten accustomed to being in that role in a conservation bank. And there's other issues like that come up.
Believe me, I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. David, EDF was really a pioneer in the conservation banking mechanism and in terms of an entrepreneurial solution to Endangered Species Act issues. But recently, and you mentioned this in your opening comments, the EDF has been moving towards the idea of these term conservation agreements. Talk a little bit about that evolution and why you think that might be necessary.
I would characterize it more, Jeff, as moving towards a mechanism, especially for these landscape-dependent species, that will streamline and lower the burden for large numbers of landowners to participate in conservation. I mean, we'd love to see millions of acres under permanent easement for the prairie chicken, no question about it. But that's not going to be the reality anytime soon. We've certainly recognized the value of term agreements to conservation through our experience with Safe Harbor which is the regulatory assurance I mentioned earlier, and all the Farm Bill programs. I mean, the CRP program, which I talked about earlier, having so much benefit for the chicken, and those are typically 10 or 15-year agreements. But specifically, you know, in the mitigation arena, there are certainly permanent agreements, permanent impacts, which need to be offset with permanent credits or permanent mitigation. There are also a variety of temporary impacts, pipelines that go in, and then if you restore above ground, there are some cases where there are temporary impacts like that, or if you open up a construction area to put in a well pad and then allow a significant amount of that area to grow back. So there are some temporary type impacts which we feel that it is reasonable to allow companies to offset those with term credits. And our experience has also been that the majority of these working type landowners are going to be much more willing to enter into a term type agreement which could generate term credits. And then maybe at some point in the future consider a longer term agreement or even an easement. So it's a stepping stone for a lot of these folks towards longer term conservation.
David, just a follow-up question. With specifically to the lesser prairie chicken, there are kind of two plans afoot that folks who've been paying attention to this issue are aware of. There's the state Fish and Game Agency plan, and then there's a plan that EDF has been working on. Can you talk about the differences between the two plans?
Yeah, there's some differences and there's some similarities. I would say there's three key differences. We have been working with a group of energy companies as well as a group of agricultural stakeholders, folks who they were very interested in working on all the details of the plan from the starting point. And so it was important for them to be engaged in a plan where they were there from the start in deciding all the details. And, you know, it's energy companies like Chevron and BP and Sandridge and Chesapeake and folks that represent about 20% of the estimated occupied range of the species. So it's a significant area. And then some of the Farm Bureau groups and Plains cotton growers and Texas and Southwestern cattle raisers and some of the other agricultural groups. So one of the differences was that they wanted to be at the table for all the decisions. Two was that on both sides, on the ag side as well as the energy side, they wanted a market-based system. In other words, for the landowners who are generating credits, either permanent credits or term credits, they wanted to decide what the price would be for them to offer those credits to the energy companies. And the energy companies will compete to buy those. And that's how these groups, the ag groups and the energy companies, I mean, they operate in a market-based environment every day, so that's something they're used to. So they wanted a market-based system. That's a second key difference. The third is, for the energy companies in particular, they wanted absolute certainty that they could operate if this species goes on the list next month. And that certainty is only guaranteed by a permit, a Section 10 permit. I know we've got this potential for the 4D rule attached to a threatened listing. Those are typically litigated by various groups. You know, 4D is not a permit. It's an exclusion or an exemption of some type from take or incidental take. These companies, they want a permit. They wanted that certainty that if this thing goes on the list next month, they would be able to operate once they had a permit. So that was also part of the package, working on HCP that Alan discussed, to get that permit to give them operational certainty.
Great, thank you. John, I got a two-part question for you. Does the state have a role in implementing the Endangered Species Act? And then secondarily, what is the difference between from a regulatory standpoint, but for a state-listed and a federally listed species in Texas?
Easy.
Yeah. Next question. Gosh, I've got to really think about that. That would have been a good question to have ahead of time. Do we have a role in implementing the Endangered Species Act? Our role is to provide data to the federal government related to how we believe populations are persisting or not persisting on the landscape, and we've we've been very clear that we don't make listing decisions. And so our role has been one of simply trying to work with landowners to conserve wildlife species, whether they're listed or pre-listing. And so that's about as far as I want to go on that aspect. The other aspect of threatened and endangered, federal versus state, that's even more interesting. There are fewer protections, of course, on a state-listed species. And one of the things that we have done in my program since I came on board is begun to take a hard look at how do species make it on the state list. In some cases, our policy is if it makes it on the federal list, then it moves to the state list. In other cases, it doesn't. And so what we've been doing over the years has been looking at how are species doing. If they're declining, then we think that they may need some protection at the state level. But we have really been taking a hard look at how we're going to begin to run species through these different kind of matrices to determine whether or not species should be state listed or not. So,
Great.
Can I say something?
Sure. Yes.
I just wanted to say something about the state's involvement with the Endangered Species Act. So when you get my presentation, if you care to look at it, it's slide 10. But one of the things that we're hoping to do in the next 2 years is, and we've actually started, but to further this effort called the Species Status Assessment. And the Species Status Assessment is just a broad thesis of everything that we know about the species, everything we believe the species needs for long-term viability, the threats, whatever it is. The idea is this is the kind of information that could be gathered at any time, and hopefully in coordination with the state or universities or whoever has the information. And so this document, this species status assessment, which exists for a couple species in our region, but not very many, is to provide the foundation for us to make listing decisions. So slide 10, the one that I just referred to, actually has these two pyramids, with one pyramid upside down, one with the pyramid pointed up, with the Fish and Wildlife Service receiving a petition, doing the documentation, and then reviewing and writing, and then putting out a public notice. So the flip side is if we can actually put together the species status assessment with our partners, we would have all the information needed on the species, its life history, its long-term needs, whatever it is that's needed. That will then inform the decision analysis, so that when we actually have a petition or need to make a decision on listing, we have the information that has been provided to us by a wider group of individuals. Because right now, when we receive a petition to list, as you know, we only look at what's actually in that petition. This is an effort to kind of flip that around. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about the state's role in endangered species.
Great. Thank you. You're welcome. So I can open it up to questions. We've got about a half an hour now. So anybody got questions, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yes, ma'am.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't one key difference between a state's listing of a species as endangered or threatened versus the, the federal listing is that the state doesn't protect habitat? It's just, okay. Can y'all talk about that a little bit more?
I mean, that is certainly true in Texas. It's not true in all states. Probably the strongest endangered species law in the country is the California Endangered Species Act, that actually has a concept of fully protected species for which there is no exception to the take prohibition. But in Texas, the state law does not extend to habitat the way that the federal law does through the regulatory interpretation of the word harm.
But I would also say that the actual critical habitat designation is a separate line in the listing. So you might say we have listed this species and we have listed its critical habitat. So it's actually two listings, which I guess the state doesn't. This state doesn't do that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Quick question. We're talking about the distinction between endangered and threatened. One of the the terms that's been talked around in this conference a little bit is candidate species. Can you kind of compare and contrast as much as about What's the subtle difference between a threatened and candidate? Is there?
Sure. Actually, there's a few levels, but we have what's called a candidate notice of review. Every year, we put forth information on those species that we consider candidates. And a candidate species is one where technically we have enough information to decide that this species may warrant listing. It may warrant listing. We have enough information right now. We're putting together our 5-factor analysis or some form of a 5-factor analysis to make that decision. Candidate species on the federal list don't have any take provision. They're treated just as any native species that the state might manage. In between a candidate and a listed species, we also have proposed species, which you're probably familiar with. So typically something is a candidate. This is what the multi-district litigation has forced us to do. It has forced us to deal with those hundreds of species that's been on that list for, my entire career, and make a decision. Yes, no, make a decision. The answer, if the answer is yes, then typically, they become proposed. If the answer is no, then they become not warranted. Do you want to say something else about that? Like you had something, Alan.
No, I don't think so, actually. I thought that was good.
Julie.
Could you explain a little bit greater detail the concept of a habitat exchange and how, I'm understanding it to be basically similar to a wetlands mitigation. From a species standpoint, how do you ensure that the habitat that's being protected for them is the same or similar quality, or you were saying net increase in habitat quality or species number? How does that work?
The idea behind a habitat exchange is to get the regulatory documents in place and set up an administrative type role to engage landowners in conservation. So it could be a permanent easement to generate permanent credits, could be a term agreement to generate term credits. There is something called a habitat quantification tool, which, typically, a lot of banks, something like the golden cheek warbler is just all based on acres. Acreage of habitat is converted into credits. Sometimes it's a little bit more sophisticated in looking at the quality of habitat. With the habitat exchange, we're taking that a step further. In the case of the lesser prairie chicken in particular, we feel we know enough about the habitat to be able to measure certain aspects of the vegetation that we know to be important to the chicken, as well as the context of the surrounding landscape. Is a site surrounded by crops or is it surrounded by native grassland? That's going to make a big difference to something like a prairie chicken. So the scientists have actually identified various characteristics of the habitat and the landscape context and put that into a fairly simple formula to calculate credits. So a landowner could have 1,000 acres of varying stuff, grassland and cropland. We can apply this tool and actually identify how many credits they have. It's going to be, if it's perfect, that 1,000 acres could be 1,000 credits, or what we call 1,000 functional acres. It's probably going to be something less than that. And running through that habitat quantification tool will tell you, is it 400 credits, maybe it's poor quality and can be improved. So it actually gives us a way to measure uplift of habitat quality, and that's where we want to get to. A lot of these programs are based on, how many acres have we enrolled, and that's great, but that doesn't necessarily measure the quality or the benefit to the species, just a pure acreage number. We need to see actual uplift in habitat quality and some form of protection, attached to that. So the exchange administrator, handles all those roles. They have folks who run through the habitat quantification tool. Landowners have to sign a contract or an easement, depending on the circumstances. The credits will be verified by an independent verifier. They'll be serialized, they'll be registered, and there'll be a unique serial number. So all these things can be tracked. Another big issue about achieving conservation for these species is transparency. What is actually happening on the ground, and is this something the public can see and have confidence that conservation is actually occurring? So that's another key piece of this.
So is there any future impact or conservation area for the prairie chicken, and then the adjacent landowner decides he wants to put in a wind farm, and now you're right next to it. I mean, does that prohibit the potential future uses around that area?
Well, no, I mean, you can't, I mean, it's just like, a conservation bank of 100 acres for the warbler. You can't
Well, right, but
affect
right
what's
up
happening
front,
around
you
you.
could.
Well, not, if it's owned by somebody else, you can't necessarily have an influence on that. But the habitat, just to go into a little bit more detail, the habitat quantification tool doesn't just look at what's going on the site. It looks at multiple scales. It goes out for a 3-mile radius is the next larger scale, then a 6-mile radius is the next larger scale, because this is a species that just needs vast areas of intact habitat, as you know. So the tool looks at multiple scales going out just an enormous distance, because we realize that, yes, transmission line or wind farm or whatever going up is going to influence what happens at that site for the chicken.
Cliff?
Yeah, can I ask a little bit more about the transparency issue? How, because you said it's an important thing, but how do you ensure that transparency? How would somebody who's independent of the habitat exchange or anybody that you're working with, if they really wanted to drill down into the detail and see how it's doing, how would they do that?
We haven't completely solved that problem yet, Cliff. I mean, it's a big issue. You won't get large numbers of farmers and ranchers to participate if you just put all their information on the web. They won't do it. So that's a real challenge. We're working now. I mean, the first step for us is to give the Fish and Wildlife Service enough access to the information without running into FOIA issues where all that information goes out to the general public. We're trying to advance beyond existing efforts to give them full access in a situation where they can see everything, every detail, landowner name, the tract boundary and everything, but in a setting where they can't necessarily take paper out the door kind of deal. That's kind of the first step. And then we also have this independent verification of what's going on every landowner's property. And again, we're not anticipating that all that information is going up on the internet, but some form of aggregation of that information, again, from an independent third-party verifier, will be available to the public.
There's definitely a balance there.
Exactly.
What we're trying to do is help the landowners feel comfortable with doing something.
Right. Right. But to give the public certainty that, yes, that conservation is actually happening.
Jeff, I have a question that's sort of related to a specific species that hasn't been talked about yet, but it goes with some of these other points. And that is, 2 or 3 years ago in Texas, we had this firestorm of controversy about the Dune sagebrush lizard, and supposedly the potential listing of that candidate species was going to be the doom of the oil and gas industry in West Texas. And of course, at least for a certain time, the listing was delayed as a result of conservation agreements. But there's been a lot of concern about whether those conservation agreements are really working to conserve the species. So I was wondering if anybody could give an update on that situation, and what does that situation tell us in terms of how we deal with trying to protect the species outside the listing context?
This is just my personal opinion, but I think when Cliff and David talk about a balance on transparency, it wasn't achieved in the dune sagebrush lizard. I just read this week, because I was bored awaiting my witness testimony in a trial we're both in, but I was bored and read Defenders of Wildlife brief in that case. It's compelling.
You might talk about that. That was something that you mentioned that you've been involved in a case recently, both of you, involving conservation values and conservation easements. You might talk about that a little bit more. I'm sure that would be of interest.
Yeah, it might be of
Can I
interest.
say
Yeah.
something to this guy?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
before you go back to that lovely court case, I would say, I didn't read the same documents. We were in different waiting rooms. But it's okay that there's questions about the adequacy of the conservation plan. I think that we have some expectation that there may be some variability in what's successful and what's not. And if it turns out that parts of it are not productive, I don't think that that challenges the entire plan. I think we just need to be true to the goals that we've established in there and figure out how we can use adaptive management to stay on course. Yeah, that's my goal.
Follow up about that. What does Fish and Wildlife Service do to try to determine whether or not the efforts to preserve the species through the conservation agreements are actually having a positive effect? Or how, you've got limited resources, you've got even more limited resources now because of federal budget decisions. How are you able to do that, or how can that be?
It's tough. It's really tough. It's the same group of people doing the same things. We rely heavily on our partners. We rely on the applicants to provide us information on their monitoring. We rely on information that we gather. I don't know whether or not there's ever been a situation where we've totally decided that an effort was underway. We may have asked for it. Some things to change, but we also have the assurances policies where we don't go back and ask for things. I don't know the specifics of the lizard here. I'm just not familiar with it, but I would tell you that it's very difficult for us to do that work on our own. We need to have it. We need to hear from you. We need to hear from the folks who are there on the ground. Yeah.
Just let Alan, I think you ought to
Alan's
talk
gonna
about
talk
that
about-
case
about-
just real quick, and then we'll get back to the questions.
Okay, just because the topic here is the intersection of endangered species and land trust efforts, this is a case I think of very unusual. A partnership acquired a 3,700-acre ranch in central Texas, and the partners within the partnership, there ended up being 40-some of them, each received a 5-acre homestead within the ranch on which they would be able to develop essentially a 1-acre lot, and then the 3,500-acre balance of the ranch would be held in common under the partnership as recreational property. They then took a charitable, they donated an easement on the 3,500 acres that wouldn't have houses on it, and took a charitable contribution for that. The Internal Revenue Service rejected the charitable contribution and hired a professor from A&M who opined that this very, very limited low-density housing associated with 3,500 acres of conservation would rob the property of its conservation values, which I mentioned before is important to the IRS. And my client then initiated litigation against the IRS about their refusal on this. At the same time, when the IRS refused this and had the A&M professor hired, they realized that maybe they'd had an issue with the Fish and Wildlife Service because what the professor at A&M said was, you got golden cheek warbler habitat and this is not in compliance, you're affecting the warblers, you're ruining them as a conservation value, et cetera. So we promptly went over to Deborah's predecessor in the Arlington office and laid out what all was going on and developed a plan to get a habitat conservation plan approved for the balance of the efforts at this site. And it actually is the second what's called low effect habitat conservation plan that will be approved in this region ever. And what low effect means is that the service has determined that it should be categorically excluded from review under the National Environmental Policy Act. And that proposal by the service to issue that permit has gone through its comment period, and there have been no responses to comments. So I think it's highly likely, and I won't put Deborah on the spot, but highly likely that we'll see a low effect permit for this project soon. I've just been astounded that somebody who was willing to conserve 3,500 acres in perpetuity with a national land trust and leave only 200 for other activities has been treated this way. Either we mean it or we don't. But I think for those of you who are really coming at this from the land trust side, it's a cautionary tale.
The one thing that I would say is that it's a very good plan. I don't know about the easement portion, but the habitat conservation plan is a very good plan. It's going to do great things for the warbler.
Back to the 4D rule, is that interpreted on a kind of a case-by-case scenario?
Yes.
So what so that indicates that is a moving target within a case-by-case scenario.
Correct.
I just can't let this session go without bringing this up, and I kind of want to tie this really kind of for you, Alan, but I want to get I'm going to try to involve you with this answer, John, as well. Speaking of plans, the Balcones Conservation, Canyons Conservation Plan isn't perpetual. It's coming up again, right? Can you comment on that, what the future of that is? And I guess
Sure.
with that, I guess the other part pointing on with you, John, is as a consumer of Texas state parks, it seems like in the last little while, several years, I'm hearing, well, there's golden sheep warblers in this park now. We found those, and so we got somehow tie this together. I don't know if you can do this, but so we got the factor of endangered species on land that's really for public recreation, state holdings, and also invasive species. The same state parks, I don't name them, but where we now know there's golden sheep warblers. There's also quite a hog problem in the riparian areas. I don't know. I just wonder if there's any tie-in to what really this view about the future of the Balcones Plan.
I'll say two things that I think are relevant to tie them together. The Balcones Plan had a 30-year term, but that was for the authorized take of warblers and vireos under the plan. So at 30 years, which is coming up in 26, the authorization for the take will go away. The conservation of the plan is permanent. All of that is permanent, 100%. So it'll be there. But you mentioned the parks, and that's an interesting point to me right now, near and dear to my heart. I've got a client who, at the River Place Municipal Utility District, who has a warbler preserve on their property, ostensibly part of the Balcones Plan, and they built a beautiful, beautiful, very well done footpath within this, and got the pleasure of a cease and desist order from the federal agencies on that. And in my conversations with the service, I've said, is this really, really where we want to go? Is the biology really justifying that you can't have a trail in warbler habitat? And what I thought about was what you said. Our state parks, a lot of them have warblers. And are we really saying we shouldn't have trails in them? Of course, the federal Balcones National Wildlife Refuge has unrestricted trails in warbler habitat. So kind of a strange circumstance. Sorry, soapbox.
And so, he said that was a soapbox for those of you that didn't hear. The question about state parks and state lands and how we manage and balance the recreational needs with the biological concerns as well as invasive species, that's something our state park staff deal with every day. And in fact, we just had something that came to us talking about rock climbing in certain state parks impacting certain bats and their roosts, et cetera. That was a constituent that brought that up. And so in talking to our natural resource folks in the state parks to try to address this issue, is this true, is this not true, the conversation turned to, we deal with this all the time. When we determine where we're going to put a road, where we determine where we're going to put campsites, where we determine where we're going to put trails, all of these natural resource issues are kind of brought to bear. And sometimes, yes, we don't put things in places because of the natural resource issues. We don't put trails in certain places. We don't put roads in certain places. And so that's a balancing act that each of our state parks has to deal with on a daily basis. And this idea of invasive species, it is scary. You mentioned hogs. That's one of the bad ones. If you haven't heard of tawny crazy ants, keep your ears open, because that one is a horror film that's waiting to happen. It's a new invasive ant that's, they say, worse than fire ants, outcompetes fire ants, and people say when they get tawny crazy ants, they want fire ants back. So these are the things that our state park lands are having to deal with, and it's just a daily battle to determine how do you deal with that, especially when you consider restricted resources.
Well, thanks for both answers. I would just follow up and say, that is a really huge opportunity for just public awareness and stewardship opportunities to kind of go and say, this is kind of you have more of the role of a national wildlife refuge, which is really there for the species rather than the recreation. Kind of leverage that for all of us. I mean, it's part of the conversation.
And I would add, if I can, I would add that one of the things we all understand is you got to have people out enjoying those resources and those features within reason. You know, you can love a park to death, but at the same time, you can lock the gates, and all of a sudden, support for, you know, these kinds of things that we all care about begins to go away. And so there's always that delicate balance of, can we do this? Can we allow this recreational opportunity while still maintaining the integrity of the biological, ecological systems?
Thank you. Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, this invasive species thing is, I mean, even at the simplest level, South Texas, the Valley, we try to encourage wildlife photography in cases to replace cattle and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as you take the cattle off and try to make it prettier for bird habitat and all that kind of stuff, you get all kinds of grasses that choke out the native grasses. And you know, when we have a conservation easement and the landowner's struggling to not run cattle on the property, and we tell him, you really ought to be going and killing this invasive grass, or, you know, are you doing what you're, the whole issue of invasive species has got us all tied up. And it's not good for endangered animals, it's not good for public use, it's not good for, but I don't know what to do about it.
I would say that aside from the lack of long-term sustainable funding, because that kind of is the umbrella that, you know, if we had all the money in the world, we could do a lot of these things. I would say besides that, invasive species is one of the most grave issues we face.
Bob?
There was some discussion about the state's role in endangered species, and then there was some discussion about publicity and the sagebrush lizard. And Alan, you talked about particular habitat conservation, but maybe you could talk about how the state treats, has sort of, if you will, different approaches to within different agencies of different to some of these issues in state law.
Yeah, Texas is alone in the states in a provision that designated the comptroller of the state, which is an elected position, as the chair of a committee to oversee endangered species issues. And in every other state in the union, that goes to something like, lots of different names, but something like the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So in my humble opinion, it's a very strange schism we're dealing with here in the state, where we have a non-expert agency that's been put in the position of essentially running the largest of the major things going on. And in fact, the comptroller is the permittee for the dune sagebrush lizard permit. So it's a very unusual circumstance. And, you know, it was, I think, created largely because of an individual who had a long background in these issues, starting when she was in the State House and then as the State Agricultural Commissioner. And I think the legislature had some faith in that individual, but that individual has announced that she's not going to run for comptroller again. And so we have a state law that's going to have presumably somebody with a CPA background as the Dean of Endangered Species within the state. So it's a very, very, very odd circumstance. I will say that we talked about the Heritage Program, and the original sort of divestiture of the Heritage Program from the Parks and Wildlife Department goes back to the mid-90s when that individual was writing property rights legislation in the Texas House. I don't know, Bob, is that? Not a lot you want to say on that?
Without naming names. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
Well, this may be more of a statement than a question, but I'm just thinking that kind of my first introduction to the idea that the plants were important to the whole ecology came from signs that were at Hamilton Pool, the beloved Austin Hamilton Pool, telling you don't step off the path and why. And I know we're in crisis of funds, but this is 50 years later, and I still remember those signs. And, you know, I know we can't go everywhere and do everything, but like in Montana, when you go to the nursery, there's a sign there that tells you, these are bad plants. If this is in your yard, take it out. or there's somebody that says, don't plant a Chinese tallow. And Texas just seems to think we're so smart and so great and we're so native. And it seems to me we're just so away from the ball. Couldn't there be a collaboration between the people, you, who know, and the guy that writes the column for the paper and says this is a beautiful plant, has these pretty little lamberts?
Just one sort of,
Terrifying.
I am involved with the University of Texas Wildflower Center, and it's a tremendous resource on those issues, both with the Sustainable Sites Initiative, but also all this information on native plants and non-native plants. And so anybody who's really interested in that topic, it's a great resource.
I would also add Texas Parks and Wildlife Department takes very seriously our education role, and we have the Texas Wildscapes program as well as other educational programs, all specifically designed to try to address the very thing that you're discussing.
Unless I'm mistaken about labor wildlife, which I truly support, I don't think they show the pictures of the invasive plants because they don't want you to get confused. But if you're looking at a plant and trying to figure out if it's native or not, you've got that 1,000 plant database. It sure would be nice if you could see the one that you have in your hand and say, oh, this is bad, had a big X over it.
I think we have time for a couple more.
This is kind of a nag, I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to say this correctly, or I don't know if it's a question, but we go back to the start of this discussion and we talk about this lawsuit, and there's this backlog of all of these candidate species, and we hear that, we know that conservation banks don't get turned around on a dime, and neither do these exchanges, which is kind of this somewhat of a seemingly somewhat quicker type approach and a little more voluntary and so on and so forth. And then I think you hear, I do, from landowners in Texas who are scared to death that there are about to be a whole however many of these potential 200 candidate species jammed down their throats, with the implications that come with that to industry and to landowners. And I'm just sitting here trying to figure out how do we square it? How does that square? I mean, where Fish and Wildlife is saying they're not going to be able to expedite any of these plans and this stuff, and the processes are long, slow processes. I just kind of sitting here with this spinning around saying, where does this go?
It's going to be an interesting few years.
I guess so. Stay tuned.
We struggle a lot with that, about how to prevent the need to list, and that's kind of the way we think about this. And with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, our bread and butter is private landowners, and we have wildlife management plans on the landscape everywhere. And so our program has been doing everything we can to look at that tidal wave that's coming and prioritize and see what species can we actually move the needle on, which ones are so close that, and we have so little data that we're not sure we can even affect the conservation status of that species in time. These are real world questions that we talk about in our program. And so what we're doing is we're trying to look at that list, look at our Texas Natural Diversity Database, use predictive modeling, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to be here today, is to, once we start producing predictive model maps and you start layering map upon map, you start to see where can we get the most bang for our conservation buck. And if we have land conservation that's either placing conservation easements on these properties or purchasing them outright, if we have 2 years, 3 years, however many it might be before a particular species comes up for the proposed review, we can move the needle on some of that. And granted, we sit around the room and think, we're probably not going to be able to affect that one, but this one, we really believe we can. And the other thing we've been looking at is what is the range? I mean, if it's 10% of the range of that particular species is in Texas, we could conserve every piece of that property in Texas and we still wouldn't be able to move the needle. It's out of my agency's hands, or even the landowners in Texas. But if we have, which we do, many species that are largely found in Texas, we have the power to be able to change some things. And so the encouraging thing for us is to be able to finally kind of in some of these examples see this is going to be targeted for 2016, 2017, 2018. And as difficult, admittedly, as difficult as this whole process has been and will continue to be over the next couple of years, if there is a silver lining, I will say that there are more people now in my division of my agency that are sitting at the table saying, let's really get serious about this. We have 3 years or 2 years to really make a difference. And so to me, trying to be an optimist, I think that's kind of a good thing. We're finally sitting down and talking about some of these issues that we would not have talked about before. That's kind of my take on how do we really try to marry this, because it is lining up. A lot of people see that handwriting on the wall, and we're finally getting some people who said we need to get serious. And again, that's me trying to be an optimist, but I do see a silver lining there.
I think
One thing I just want to observe, if I may, Jeff, we've had a lot of talk about this multi-district litigation, and it's been very, very politicized. And I just want to remind those of us who should remember, and those of us who weren't around, let you know that the last big listing settlement was Fund for Animals, and it was the first President Bush in the last days of his last term. So it's really not a political issue. It's an underfunded agency trying to deal with a statute that has got a fairly inflexible process for addressing these species.
Peter, you're our last question, by the way. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for participating. I think one of the I'll let Peter ask his question, but one of the answers is in this room. The land trust community, at least in Texas, will hopefully Fish and Wildlife Service, and to the degree Parks and Wildlife's involved, will work with the land trust community to help kind of solve these problems and bridge the gap with private landowners. But take it away, Peter.
A little comment. We're speaking about wildlife, and we're talking about species, and I realize it's what people see, and I realize the species is only what they see. I think our real goal is to preserve the habitat, because without the habitat, we don't have the species. And so I was just wondering, is there any list of endangered habitats that would help species? And if that list is around, why not circulate?
We do have features in our Texas Natural Diversity database that are rare communities. Other features on the landscape, whether bat roosts, rookeries, et cetera. So significant things that are not just species oriented, but your point is well taken, and that's why when we start talking about predictive modeling or any of these kinds of things where we lay out an individual species, that's great. I mean, as a biologist, I love to look at those maps and say, wow, this area right here really gives us good bang for our buck. But that becomes infinitely more powerful when you start to layer 10 and 20 species on top of that. Then you begin to look at entire communities, and it starts to give you a little bit clearer picture. But yes, we do have some of those features in our database.
A number of the NGOs are doing that at a regional scale. The Conservation Fund has something they call green infrastructure, where they try to, over a large multi-state region, not just describe where the species are, but where the habitats are that are rare or important, and where the connectivity needs to be, and that sort of thing.
And additionally, if I could, I know we're running a little bit late, we have a recent development in Parks and Wildlife called Conservation Opportunity Areas, which is looking more at landscape vegetation and things like that. It's a different approach than specific species predictive modeling. And so some of those kinds of things are going on, but your point's well taken.
Thank you all. And thank you, panelists.